Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. In tonight's episode, we're going to go into the heart of Thailand, where something strange and deeply unsettling happened not too long ago. So this story takes place in a small town known for its sacred cemetery shrines. Locals speak in hushed tones about these places, warning travelers never to disrespect the offerings left for the spirits. Outsiders often see the flowers, the incense, the small tokens of remembrance, and think nothing of them. But what happens when someone ignores these warnings? Well, that's where the terror begins. One young traveler, unaware of the customs and thinking he was simply admiring the vibrant flowers, decided to pluck a bouquet from one of these shrines. At first, it seemed harmless, just a moment of curiosity, but as night fell, the air around his guest house grew heavy and still. Shadows moved in ways that defied logic. Whispers echoed through empty rooms, and a cold, unseen presence seemed to follow his every step. What started as a simple act of thoughtlessness was about to spiral into a nightmare that would test his very sanity. The young traveler, a man in his mid-20s named Ethan, had always been drawn to the unknown. He loved exploring places off the beaten path, chasing stories that others would avoid. His backpack was light but carefully packed, filled with essentials for solo travel, and a small notebook where he jotted every strange sight and unsettling encounter. Ethan had arrived in Thailand eager to experience the culture, the food, and the quiet corners of towns that tourists rarely noticed. But there was one place that intrigued him more than any bustling market or serene temple, the town's cemetery shrines. The cemetery was not like any he had seen before. At the edge of the small town, it stretched farther than the eye could see, a labyrinth of graves and shrines surrounded by old, twisting trees. The ground was uneven, the stone markers weathered and covered in moss, the air heavy with the scent of incense and damp earth. Flowers of all colors had been carefully placed on many of the shrines, some fresh, some faded with time. Small statues and carved figurines dotted the spaces between graves, creating an almost surreal, silent city of the dead. It was beautiful in a way that was almost unsettling, as if the quiet reverence carried a weight that pressed down on anyone who dared to enter. Ethan had come with a purpose beyond sightseeing. He wanted to capture the essence of these shrines, to document the ways locals honored the dead, and to understand the delicate balance between the living and the spirits that lingered in such spaces. He had spoken briefly to a few townspeople who offered vague warnings, muttering that some shrines were older than the town itself, and that the spirits there could notice disrespect. He nodded politely, curiosity overriding caution, imagining that the warnings were little more than superstition. As he wandered through the cemetery, the atmosphere shifted with each step. The sunlight filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting long shadows across the ground. Birds were silent, the usual chirping absent, replaced by the distant rustle of leaves that sounded almost like whispered voices. Ethan felt an unfamiliar tension in the air, a subtle pull that made him glance over his shoulder more often than usual. Yet he pressed on, fascinated by the delicate arrangements of flowers, the tiny bowls of fruit, and the small candles flickering in tiny metal holders. Each shrine told a story, a life remembered, and a presence that refused to be forgotten. Ethan paused at one particularly vibrant shrine, where a bouquet of bright marigolds and jasmine had been carefully arranged. Something about the flowers seemed almost too perfect, too alive against the muted grays of the weathered stone. He crouched to get a closer look, noting the intricate patterns in the carvings, the way the incense smoke curled and twisted in the still air. It was then, almost without thinking, that he plucked a flower from the bouquet, tucking it into his notebook as a keepsake. At that moment, the world felt oddly quiet, the wind stilling and the shadows seeming to stretch longer than before. Ethan didn't notice it then, but the air had grown heavier, charged with a presence that watched silently, waiting. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the cemetery seemed to transform. The fading light cast eerie silhouettes across the ground, and the once quiet paths seemed narrower, more confining. Ethan decided to leave, promising himself he would return to photograph more shrines tomorrow. But as he retraced his steps through the twisting paths, a subtle unease had begun to creep over him, a sense that his small act of curiosity had not gone unnoticed. The town outside the cemetery felt distant now, the familiar sounds of daily life muffled, as if the very air around him had thickened with silent judgment. Something was waiting, something that would not let a stolen flower be forgotten. And Ethan would soon come to understand that the consequences of disrespecting these sacred spaces were far more severe than he could have imagined. Ethan returned to his small guest house as night fell, the sky painted in bruised purples and darkening blues. The streets of the town were quiet now, the occasional motorcycle hum fading into the distance. He had expected some unease after leaving the cemetery, but the first signs of something amiss began subtly, almost innocuously. It started with the way the key to his room felt unusually heavy in his hand, the metal cold to the touch, as if it had absorbed the chill of the surrounding night. Unlocking the door, he stepped inside, expecting the familiar musty scent of aged wood and linen, yet the room smelled different, slightly metallic, faintly of decay, a smell that he could not place. He set his backpack on the floor and noticed that the small bouquet of flowers he had taken from the shrine seemed to droop, even though it had only been an hour since he had plucked it. The petals curled inward, as if retreating from the air, and the vibrant orange and white colors seemed muted under the dim light of the single overhead bulb. Ethan shook his head, blaming jet lag and fatigue for the sense of unease that had begun to creep over him. Still, he placed the flowers carefully on the nightstand and opened his notebook, intending to jot down his thoughts and sketches from the cemetery visit. As he wrote, he heard it the faintest of whispers, almost like the rustling of leaves, though the window was shut and the night was eerily still. He froze, pen in hand, listening intently. At first, he convinced himself it was his imagination, the quiet after a long day amplifying the smallest noises. But then the whispers came again, more deliberate this time, almost forming syllables he could not understand. They seemed to come from the direction of the flowers, soft and fleeting, vanishing whenever he tried to focus on them. A shiver ran down his spine, and he told himself to calm down. Perhaps it was just the wind outside or the distant hum of a night market. Trying to shake the feeling, he closed the notebook and moved to the small bathroom to wash his hands. The mirror above the sink reflected him perfectly, or so he thought. As he leaned closer to rinse his hands, he noticed a subtle distortion in his reflection. For a moment, it was as if his image hesitated, lagging behind his movements. He blinked rapidly, convinced it was fatigue, but the sensation of being slightly out of sync with his own reflection remained. Heart rate quickening, he turned from the mirror and paused, noticing that the bouquet on the nightstand had shifted slightly, though he was certain he had placed it carefully in the center of the surface. He reached out to adjust the flowers, feeling the petals brush his fingers, and immediately a gust of cold air swept through the room, despite the sealed windows. The room seemed to contract, the shadows at the corners deepening unnaturally. Ethan stepped back, fumbling for the light switch, and the overhead bulb flickered, casting the room into brief darkness before snapping back to life. Every object in the room seemed sharper now, more defined, almost hyper-real, yet somehow wrong. The notebook, the chair, the small dresser all felt slightly displaced, as if they had shifted imperceptibly while he was distracted. For the next few hours, Ethan tried to sleep, but rest would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel a presence at the foot of the bed, something observing him, waiting silently. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them, stretching along the walls like liquid. Each time he turned his head, the shadows froze, only to resume their slow crawl the instant he faced another direction. The whispers returned intermittently, just barely audible, seeming to weave themselves into the creaks of the building and the hum of the ceiling fan. He tried to rationalize, telling himself that he was alone in an unfamiliar place and that his mind was playing tricks, but the cold, persistent sensation of being watched was impossible to ignore. By midnight, Ethan noticed that his reflection in the mirror was no longer entirely his own. In the dim light, the edges of his face seemed to blur, and there were fleeting moments where his eyes appeared hollow, blackened like tiny voids. The flowers on the nightstand now trembled as if alive, petals quivering in a wind he could not feel. When he looked away for even a few seconds and then back, the bouquet appeared slightly different, arranged differently than he had left it, as if unseen hands had moved it. Panic began to edge into his mind, a creeping anxiety that made his pulse pound. Desperate for a sense of normalcy, Ethan tried calling the guest house reception. The phone rang once, twice, then went dead. The room fell into a silence so complete it pressed against his ears, making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He checked the door. It was still locked. Yet a subtle draft whispered through the frame, carrying with it the faint, pungent scent of soil and decaying petals. The whispers intensified, now overlapping with fleeting glimpses of something moving in the periphery of his vision, a shadowy figure just beyond the edge of the lamp's glow. When he spun to face it, there was nothing there, yet the sensation of its gaze lingered. The hours crawled slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity of unease. Ethan could not shake the feeling that the moment he had taken the flower, he had crossed a boundary, a line invisible to most but unmistakable to the spirits who guarded these sacred spaces. It was not yet dangerous, not yet violent, but the small, persistent disturbances were enough to make him question every decision that had led him here. Every creak of the building, every flicker of light, every whispering wind seemed to whisper a single, silent warning. The spirits were aware, and they would not forget the disrespect shown to their sacred shrine. By the time dawn approached, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. The bouquet drooped further, petals darkening at the edges, and the shadows in the room lingered longer than the first rays of sunlight dared to stretch across the floor. It was only the beginning, he realized with a sinking heart. The first signs of retribution had begun, subtle and unnerving, and whatever awaited him in the coming days would not be as easy to dismiss. Something had been disturbed, and the unseen eyes of the cemetery shrines were now fixed firmly upon him. Ethan's unease only deepened in the days that followed. Each morning, he awoke to find the bouquet of stolen flowers in slightly different positions, petals drooping further, colors fading as if life was slowly being drained from them. Even more unsettling, he began noticing faint smudges on his hands and arms, as if invisible hands had brushed against him during the night. The whispers that had haunted him the first evening now came in fragments he could almost understand. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to echo from the corners of his room, from the floorboards, from the walls themselves. One afternoon, Determined to confront his unease, Ethan returned to the cemetery shrines. The sky was overcast, heavy clouds casting a gray pallor over the grounds, and the usually vibrant flowers on the shrines seemed muted, almost dull in the dim light. As he walked between the stone markers, he noticed a woman sitting alone on a bench near the edge of the cemetery. She was elderly, her hair white and pulled tightly into a bun, her face lined with age and worry. When she looked up at him, her eyes were sharp, almost piercing, and, for a moment, Ethan felt as though she could see not only him but the invisible presence that followed him. "Do not touch them," she said abruptly, her voice firm, carrying a weight that seemed to make the air around them tremble. Ethan blinked, startled, unsure if she was speaking to him or if he had imagined it. "The flowers," she repeated, gesturing toward the shrines. "You cannot take what is not yours. They notice. They remember." Her words made Ethan's stomach twist. He tried to apologize, to explain that he had meant no disrespect, but before he could speak, she rose slowly, leaning on her wooden cane. Her gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering. "Many have come before you thinking it harmless," she continued. "Few leave unchanged. You must return it, or the spirits will not forgive you." Ethan's mind raced. He had never believed in curses or restless spirits, but the growing tension in his chest, the way the air felt heavier here in the cemetery, told him that her warning was no mere superstition. He nodded quickly, intending to replace the flowers, but when he turned back to the shrine, he froze. The bouquet he had taken yesterday had vanished entirely, leaving behind a faint imprint on the stone where it had rested. The petals, the stems, the vibrant orange and white colors gone, as if they had never existed. A chill ran through him, and the woman's eyes softened slightly, though her warning still hung in the air like a dark cloud. "They are angry," she said quietly. "Angry and patient. You may think you can outrun this, but the spirits follow, closer than you realize." Ethan felt a tremor of fear but tried to steady himself. The whispers returned, louder now, threading around the graves and curling through the air like smoke. He could feel a presence moving just beyond his vision, glimpses of shadow that shifted when he tried to focus. As he made his way back to the guest house, he passed under a large banyan tree. Its long roots twisted over the ground like serpents, and as he walked, he noticed small offerings tucked into the roots, coins, incense sticks, scraps of cloth. One of the scraps fluttered briefly in the breeze, revealing a tiny note inscribed with delicate Thai script. Ethan bent to read it, his eyes tracing the words he could not understand. A sudden gust of wind made the paper lift, and in that instant, he felt as if unseen eyes were burning into the back of his head. Returning to his room that evening, the second strange event occurred. The room was darker than usual, the air thicker, the faint metallic scent he had noticed on the first night stronger now. The overhead bulb flickered continuously, casting jagged shadows that moved independently from the objects in the room. Ethan saw the flowers twitch, petals bending outward as if reaching for something or someone. He tried to calm himself, but then heard a knock at the door. Hesitant, he approached and called out, but no one replied. Gathering courage, he opened the door slowly, and the hallway beyond was empty, dimly lit. Yet, he could feel the unmistakable weight of presence, pressing just beyond his vision. By now, the tension had stacked upon itself like layers of mist, each strange event amplifying the last. Whispers intertwined with fleeting glimpses of movement. Shadows stretched unnaturally. The elderly woman's warning replayed in his mind over and over. He began noticing subtle signs everywhere. Objects slightly moved from their places, mirrors that reflected the room but not always him, and a cold draft that seemed to follow him no matter where he walked. Each moment reinforced a chilling certainty he had disturbed something sacred, and the forces he had unknowingly provoked were not done with him yet. That night, as Ethan sat in the dim glow of his lamp, the whispers surged into a near-constant hum. The room itself felt alive, almost sentient, and every instinct in his body screamed that the consequences of his actions were closing in. The first complication had grown into an intricate web of unease and foreboding. The stolen flowers were gone, but their absence only made the threat more immediate, more tangible. The spirits were watching. They were angry, and Ethan was beginning to understand that whatever came next would demand far more than apologies and explanations. It would demand reckoning. Ethan had never felt so unmoored in his life. Days of restless nights, whispering shadows, and inexplicable movements had built an invisible wall around him, pressing relentlessly against his sanity. On the fourth evening, he decided he could no longer ignore the presence that had been dogging him since the moment he plucked the flowers from the shrine. Determined to confront it, he carried a small pack of incense, candles, and a notebook filled with frantic sketches and observations, hoping that some form of ritual or acknowledgement might bring clarity. The shadows in his room seemed thicker than usual, almost tangible, and the air felt electrically charged, heavy with a cold that no blanket could dispel. As he lit the first candle, the flickering flame cast distorted silhouettes across the walls. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, creeping closer to him as though drawn by the light. He placed the incense carefully on the nightstand, bowing his head and whispering words he had learned from local guides about respect and apology, though he did not fully understand their meaning. The smoke curled upward, twisting in patterns that made his eyes water, shapes forming that seemed to mimic the figures he had glimpsed in the corners of the room. His reflection in the mirror wavered again, more pronounced than ever, and for a heartbeat he swore he saw the hollow-eyed shadow of someone standing just behind him, watching silently. The first strange phenomenon occurred almost immediately. The notebook on the desk flipped open on its own, pages fluttering wildly as though caught in a breeze, though the windows were closed and the air still. Sketches he had drawn of the cemetery, the flowers, and the shrines seemed to shimmer on the paper, ink lifting slightly, as if the images themselves were alive. Ethan reached out to steady the pages, and the moment his fingers brushed the paper, a sharp, icy draft swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. Darkness swallowed the room, but he could still see faint outlines of movement shapes dancing at the edges of his vision, retreating whenever he tried to focus directly on them. Panic clawed at his chest, yet a strange compulsion urged him to continue. He lit another candle, and this time the flame revealed something horrifying. The bouquet of stolen flowers, which he had assumed gone for good, had returned to the nightstand, though it looked different. The petals were blackened at the edges, curling inward as if scorched, and a faint, unnatural glow emanated from within the center of the arrangement. The scent was not floral, it was sharp, acrid, tinged with something metallic and decayed. Ethan recoiled, realizing that this was no ordinary bouquet. It was a manifestation of the spirit's anger, a living symbol of their disapproval. And then the whispers began in earnest. This time, he could make out fragments of words, like hissing syllables, repeating again and again. Return, return, respect, apologize. The voice seemed to come from every corner of the room at once, pressing against him from above, below, behind the walls. His own voice trembled as he tried to answer, speaking apologies in broken Thai, begging for forgiveness, pleading for understanding. The shadows responded. They twisted, writhed, and grew darker, condensing into humanoid forms that advanced slowly toward him, yet without making a sound. Each step they took seemed to drain the warmth from the room, leaving Ethan shivering in a cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. Desperate to regain control, he grabbed the notebook and flung it onto the floor, scattering the pages across the room. The incense smoke spiraled upward violently, as though reacting to the disruption, and the shadows recoiled momentarily, writhing in agitation. Then a figure emerged fully from the corner of the room. It was indistinct, a form of darkness and smoke, yet its presence was suffocatingly real. Ethan could feel the weight of its gaze, an almost physical pressure, and a sense of accusation that made his stomach churn. He realized, in that terrifying moment, that the spirits were not simply watching, they were judging, enforcing a code he had broken unknowingly, a boundary he had crossed with thoughtless hands. The room seemed to collapse in on itself. Objects lifted slightly off the floor, hovering in midair, then dropped with soft thuds that made Ethan flinch. The flowers pulsed with an eerie light, the whispers forming a chorus that echoed inside his skull. And yet, amid the terror, a clarity began to emerge. The chaos was not random. Every flicker, every movement, every whisper had a purpose, a message. The spirits were demanding acknowledgement, recognition of their sacred space, and a proper act of respect. He understood now that this confrontation, though overwhelming, was a lesson. His fear, his confusion, was meant to awaken his awareness, to make him understand that the unseen forces were real, deliberate, and patient. Trembling, Ethan sank to his knees before the nightstand, bowing his head low, and whispered a sincere apology. He placed his hands over the blackened bouquet, feeling the icy chill seep through him. For the first time since the night of his theft, the shadows stilled slightly, and the room's oppressive weight lifted by a fraction. The whispers softened, becoming almost gentle, murmuring around him like a warning rather than a threat. Yet he knew this was not over. The spirits had made their presence undeniable, their power unmistakable, and their patience infinite. Ethan had survived the peak of their confrontation, but the lesson had only just begun, and the consequences of his actions were far from fully revealed. Ethan awoke the next morning, with his body still trembling, the events of the previous night replaying vividly in his mind. The shadows had receded, the cold had lifted slightly, but the room retained an oppressive stillness, an almost tangible reminder that the spirit's attention had not wavered. The bouquet of blackened flowers sat quietly on the nightstand, motionless now, yet radiating a presence that made him hesitant to approach it. He realized that he could no longer ignore the seriousness of what had happened. It was clear now. This was not a simple haunting born of imagination. Something much older, deliberate, and deeply rooted in the local traditions had been awakened. Unable to continue without answers, Ethan decided to seek guidance from the townspeople, hoping someone could explain the strange occurrences and offer a way to appease the restless spirits. He made his way to a small tea shop at the edge of town, where the elderly woman he had seen in the cemetery off on Saturday. The shop smelled of herbs, wood, and incense, and the air was warm in contrast to the chill that had haunted his guest house. When she noticed him, she gestured for him to sit and poured him a cup of steaming tea. Ethan hesitated, then asked cautiously about the flowers, the cemetery shrines, and the strange events that had plagued him since his thoughtless act. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and quiet authority. "The shrines are not merely decorative," she began. "They are sacred places where the spirits of the deceased watch over the offerings left to honor them. Flowers, incense, small tokens, each is a gesture of respect and remembrance. To remove them without permission is to take from the spirits themselves, to disrupt the balance of the living and the dead. They see every action, every thoughtless hand, and they do not forget easily." Ethan listened intently, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. "The disturbances," she continued, "the shadows, the whispers, the cold presence you have felt the spirit's attention because you have taken what was not yours. They are not vengeful without reason, but they are guardians. Their reactions are warnings, manifestations of the natural order you disrupted. The bouquet you plucked is a symbol of their displeasure. Its return to your room, blackened and altered, was meant to make you understand that respect must be restored before peace can exist." She paused, letting her words sink in. "There is a way to make amends," she added. "A ritual of apology and offering. You must return to the shrine, place fresh flowers, light incense, and speak sincerely to the spirits, acknowledging your mistake. Only then can you hope to restore balance." Ethan felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The explanation reframed everything he had experienced. The whispers were not random. The shadows were not mere tricks of light. Every unsettling occurrence was a message, a guide, a method of forcing him to recognize the importance of respect and humility. When he left the tea shop and walked back to the cemetery, the sky was overcast, the wind carrying the faint scent of incense from distant shrines. Each step he took toward the sacred grounds felt heavier, laden with the knowledge of his transgression. He approached the shrine where he had taken the flowers, noticing details he had overlooked before: the careful arrangement of offerings, the small inscriptions, and the subtle energy that seemed to hum quietly in the air. He knelt, placing fresh flowers on the shrine and lighting a stick of incense. His hands shook as he spoke words of apology, sincere and deliberate, asking the spirits to forgive his ignorance. As the incense smoke curled upward, Ethan felt a subtle shift in the air. The oppressive weight that had haunted him for days lifted slightly, and the whispers softened, carrying a tone of acknowledgement rather than accusation. The shadows around him seemed less hostile, the chill easing from his bones. Yet, even as he experienced this partial resolution, he understood that the spirit's presence had not fully withdrawn. The lesson was clear. Actions have consequences, and respect for the unseen is not optional. The spirits had shown him both their power and their patience, leaving him with a stark understanding of the boundaries that exist between the living and the dead. Returning to his guest house that evening, Ethan noticed that the room felt lighter, the shadows more normal, the bouquet on the nightstand beginning to wilt naturally rather than pulsate with unnatural energy. The mirror reflected him fully again, without hesitation or distortion. He could breathe more easily, though a faint tension lingered, a reminder that the spirits had not entirely left his side. He understood that this was not a simple haunting to be ignored or feared, but a lesson to carry forward. Small acts of disrespect could have profound, supernatural consequences, and the sacred spaces of the world demanded reverence, awareness, and humility. Ethan's perspective had shifted completely. What had begun as a moment of careless curiosity had evolved into a confrontation with forces beyond his understanding. The partial resolution gave him insight, but it also left lingering questions. How far could the spirits reach? Would other acts of ignorance bring more severe consequences? He now knew that the unseen world was neither cruel nor arbitrary, but deliberate and watchful, and that any future journey into the unknown would require both caution and respect. The revelation had reframed every strange occurrence he had experienced, showing that the disturbances were not random, but a carefully orchestrated response designed to teach, warn, and guide him back to the proper path. That night, Ethan packed his bag quietly, careful not to disturb anything in the guest house. The bouquet of flowers, now faded and fragile, sat on the nightstand, motionless, but still somehow heavy with presence. He glanced at the mirror one last time. His reflection was steady, unbroken, but he could not shake the feeling that the eyes staring back at him were only partially his own. A subtle unease lingered in the room, like a whisper he could not quite hear, pressing at the edges of his thoughts. He stepped into the hallway, leaving the door slightly ajar, and walked through the silent streets of the town. The cemetery loomed in the distance, shadows of its shrines, stretching long under the moonlight. Even from afar, he felt their gaze, cold and unwavering, and he quickened his pace, heart thudding with a mixture of fear and awe. He had done everything he could to make amends, yet a gnawing suspicion clung to him. Had the ritual been enough? Could the spirits truly forgive a thoughtless act? Or was this only the beginning of something far darker? As he reached the bus station, preparing to leave the town behind, a faint scent of incense drifted across the air, carried by a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. Ethan turned sharply, but the streets were empty, the lanterns flickering in the night wind. A sudden rustle echoed behind him, soft but deliberate, as if something or someone had followed him out. He froze, every instinct screaming, and for a heartbeat he saw movement in the shadows at the edge of the station, a figure, indistinct and dark, watching silently before disappearing into the night. Ethan boarded the bus without looking back, gripping the seat as it pulled away from the town. The buildings shrank behind him, the cemetery disappearing from view, yet the lingering chill in his chest refused to fade. The lesson had been learned, painfully and vividly, but the memory of those shadows, the whispers, and the blackened flowers remained, pressing on him with quiet insistence. As the town receded into darkness, Ethan could not escape the final thought that had begun to take root in his mind. Some acts, no matter how small, are never truly forgotten. The spirits were patient, and he had only seen the beginning of their watch. And somewhere, deep in the unseen corners of the world, they were waiting, still, silently, always. After the chilling events in the cemetery, Ethan's story reminds us that Thailand is a land where the living and the spiritual often walk side by side, and where even small acts of disrespect can awaken powerful forces. But the country's legends are not limited to warnings alone. Some, like the story of Mae Nak Phra Khanong, explore love that transcends death itself. Mae Nak's devotion to her husband, even after her tragic passing, shows the intensity of bonds that linger beyond the grave, and the consequences for those who fail to recognize the truth of the spiritual world. Both tales reveal the delicate balance between the living and the dead, and how respect or the lack of it can shape lives in ways that are both terrifying and unforgettable. One story done and one to go. I hope you like the stories so far. When I make these long videos, there are nights where I stay up really late working on them. Tomorrow, I will be uploading another video. If you don't want to miss it, please subscribe. It's free, and it would help my channel get some recognition for daily posting. Thank you. Mak returned to Phra after months away at war, his body exhausted and his mind weary from the relentless march of battles. The streets of Bangkok felt different now, quieter than he remembered, yet heavy with a sense of anticipation, as if the city itself held its breath. His journey home had been long and filled with fleeting moments of unease, shadows that seemed to move independently in the corners of his vision, sudden chills that ran along his spine, and the faint whispers of voices carried on the wind, impossible to place. He shook them off as fatigue, telling himself that the war had left him hypersensitive to every sound and movement. Phra was a district of winding alleys, wooden houses on stilts, and small canals that reflected the dim afternoon light. The community was tight-knit, familiar with the rhythms of everyday life, yet whispers of old stories and local legends always lingered beneath the surface. Mak had walked these streets countless times, but today everything felt slightly off, slightly unreal. As he approached his home, he noticed the door closed in a way that seemed deliberate, and a strange stillness hung over the small, wooden house. It was as if the air itself had thickened, waiting to see what he would do next. Mak had a single purpose in returning, to see his wife, Mae Nak, and their unborn child. The thought of their reunion filled him with warmth, and he imagined the comfort of familiar laughter, the softness of Mae Nak's presence, and the promise of home after so much absence. He pushed open the door and was greeted by an odd quiet, the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. The house looked exactly as he had left it months ago. The furniture in place, the small altar neatly arranged, and the rice bowls still set on the table as if no time had passed. Then he saw her. Mae Nak stood in the middle of the room, her figure delicate and graceful, her long black hair flowing down her back. She smiled at him, eyes bright with warmth and recognition, her hands reaching out to him as if she had been waiting every day of his absence. Behind her, he noticed a small bundle, his child sleeping peacefully, breathing steadily. Relief flooded his chest, and he rushed forward, embracing them both. The comfort of their presence made him forget the subtle oddities in the air, the unnatural stillness of the room, the faint echo of footsteps that did not match his own, and the way the shadows seemed to cling too tightly to the corners. Neighbors had watched from a distance, their faces pale with concern. They whispered warnings, hesitant to intrude, speaking of Mae Nak in hushed tones and cautioning that what Mac saw might not be as it appeared. But Mac, exhausted and overjoyed, dismissed their concerns. In his mind, the war was over, and here was the life he had been fighting to return, to the life he had dreamed of, the love he had longed for, and the child he had imagined holding in his arms. Yet beneath the surface of this perfect reunion, a sense of unease lingered. The air felt heavier, as if carrying the weight of unspoken truths. The house was familiar, yes, but it vibrated, with an energy that Mac could not place. A quiet tension that made him glance at corners and doorways with sudden suspicion. Something was different, something unsettling, though he could not yet name it. Mae Nak's warmth and love were real, but the world around them had shifted subtly, quietly, and the boundaries between life and death were beginning to blur in ways he could not yet comprehend. Mac's first days back at home were filled with joy and relief, yet subtle unease began to creep into the edges of his happiness. The house seemed unchanged, too perfect in its stillness. Objects were in their expected places, the small altar untouched, the rice bowls neat and clean, yet there was an oddness in the air that he could not name. When Mae Nak greeted him each morning with the same warmth and soft smile, he felt a tension building beneath his delight, a faint shadow in his chest. Something about her presence, though loving and familiar, seemed almost too consistent, too unchanging. The first truly strange event occurred on the third evening after his return. Mac had been preparing dinner, chopping vegetables on the wooden countertop, when he noticed something odd in the reflection of the window pane opposite him. Mae Nak was in the room behind him, standing as she usually did, but for a brief second, her image in the glass moved independently of her actual movements. She swayed slightly when he had stopped, her hand reaching toward him, even though in reality she remained perfectly still. He froze, heart racing, convinced it must be a trick of the dim lamplight, or the fatigue of his war-torn body conjuring illusions. Shaking his head, Mak turned fully to face her, and she smiled, perfectly calm, her eyes glimmering with that familiar warmth. "Mac," she said softly, "you must be tired. Rest." Her tone was comforting, yet the oddity of what he had just seen lingered in his mind, refusing to be ignored. He laughed nervously and decided to brush it off, attributing it to exhaustion. Yet the unease remained, creeping like a slow current beneath the surface of his contentment. Later that evening, as he was tucking his child into a small woven cradle, Mak noticed something else. The baby's blanket, which he had just arranged neatly, appeared slightly shifted, folded differently from the way he had left it. He frowned, certain he had adjusted it only moments ago. The slight movement might have been trivial, but it came with an inexplicable tension that made him glance around the room, half expecting to see Mae Nak watching him with a mischievous grin. Yet she sat calmly on the mat, hands folded in her lap, completely unaware, or seemingly unaware of what he had noticed. Mac began to question his own senses. Could he have been imagining these small inconsistencies? He had fought wars, survived battles, and yet here, in his own home, he felt a creeping vulnerability he had never known. The air seemed thicker than usual, carrying faint whispers that he could almost, but not quite comprehend. They sounded like the distant murmur of voices, echoing faintly from walls and corners. Each time he focused on them, the sound would dissipate, leaving him unsure whether it had been real or just his imagination. A new obstacle presented itself when Mac tried to speak with the neighbors. They had been cautious since his return, exchanging quiet glances before murmuring words of warning. One evening, a neighbor named Somchai approached him, leaning close as he spoke in hushed tones. "Mac, I must warn you," he said, eyes darting around as if afraid to be overheard. "What you see, what you believe, is Mae Nak. It may not be what you think. You cannot ignore the stories. Many have returned from war, only to find her waiting in ways that are not of this world. Please, pay attention to the signs." Mac's heart sank, torn between disbelief and growing fear. Mae Nak's presence was comforting, and yet Somchai's words planted a seed of doubt he could not easily shake. That night, as he lay in the small wooden room, he noticed yet another subtle, unnerving sign. Mae Nak moved about the house in ways that felt strangely rehearsed, almost like an echo of herself, rather than her true living form. Objects he had placed carefully in one spot would appear slightly displaced when he looked again, and the shadows around her seemed to stretch unnaturally, brushing along walls in ways that defied logic. Even more unsettling were the whispers that accompanied her movements. They were soft, distant, yet persistent, weaving through the quiet of the home like threads he could not untangle. They were not threatening, not directly hostile, but they carried a weight of warning, a sense of invisible presence urging him to notice, to question, to recognize a reality he was only beginning to glimpse. As the days passed, Mac realized he could no longer dismiss these anomalies as tricks of fatigue or stress. The inconsistencies in the house, Mae Nak's unnaturally steady presence, the subtle shifting of objects, and the cryptic murmurs all pointed toward a reality that defied simple explanation. He could feel it, the growing tension that something was not as it seemed. The first complication had arrived, and with it came the haunting question that would not leave him. Had Mae Nak truly returned as his loving wife, or was he now living alongside a spirit, bound by love but separated by death itself? The days that followed brought a mounting tension that Mak could no longer ignore. At first, the oddities had been small, subtle, a reflection that lagged, a blanket slightly shifted, but now they were impossible to dismiss. Every step he took in the house seemed to carry an echo, a presence moving just behind him. The shadows that clung to the corners of the rooms stretched unnaturally, lengthening and recoiling in ways that no ordinary light could explain. Even the gentle sway of Mae Nak's hair as she went about her tasks seemed slightly off, as if her movements were rehearsed, a perfect mimicry rather than the fluid motions of the living. One evening, Mak was preparing dinner when he noticed something that made him freeze. The small wooden door to the back room, which had been firmly closed for weeks, was ajar. The scent of incense drifted faintly from within, though he had not lit any. Hesitant, he stepped closer, the wooden floor creaking under his weight, and peeked inside. The room was empty, yet the air seemed charged, thick with expectation. On the floor, he noticed a small figure carved from wood, something he had never seen before, positioned as if watching him. It was delicate, almost lifelike, with intricate features, but its gaze felt accusatory. His chest tightened, a cold chill settling in as he realized the object had not been there before. That night, a neighbor arrived unannounced. Somchai, a man who had long been wary of the stories surrounding Mae Nak, knocked insistently at the door. His face was pale, eyes wide with concern. "Mac," he said urgently, once inside, "you must understand. What you are seeing is not what you believe. Mae Nak, she cannot leave the world she belongs to. You are in danger if you continue as though nothing has changed." Mak felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Fear, disbelief, but also frustration. He wanted to trust Mae Nak, to cling to the life he had imagined returning to. Yet Somchai's intensity left a mark, an uneasy acknowledgement that the house he called home was not quite as it seemed. As Mac lay down that night, the house seemed to pulse around him, alive with subtle disturbances. The floorboards groaned under invisible weight. The shadows shifted slightly when he wasn't looking, and whispers began to thread through the rooms. At first, they were soft, indistinct, like the hum of wind through bamboo, but soon words emerged, faint but clear. "Do not leave, do not forget. Love binds. Death cannot release." Each phrase felt directed at him, urgent and insistent. He could not tell if the voice came from Mae Nak, from the air itself, or from the spirits that lingered unseen in the corners of the house. The next day, Mak noticed another clue that unsettled him further. A candle he had lit the night before had burned down in an unusual pattern, wax pooled into shapes that resembled a small cradle, and a figure kneeling before it. He stared at the formation for long moments, a sinking realization pressing down. These were signs. Deliberate messages meant to guide him, to warn him, to make him see the truth he had refused to acknowledge. As the days progressed, the disturbances compounded. Mae Nak's interactions with the child grew increasingly unnatural. At times, the baby seemed to respond to her presence in ways that defied explanation, cooing or moving when no one had touched it, and yet the child remained entirely still in Mac's arms moments later. Objects around the house appeared subtly shifted spoons on the table, mats in the hallway, the small altar in the corner all changed in ways that suggested careful attention rather than random accident. Mac could no longer maintain the fragile comfort of normalcy. The house itself was speaking to him, layering tension upon tension, insistently revealing a reality he had tried to ignore. By evening, the combination of the second strange event, the neighbor's urgent warning, and the subtle but undeniable clues throughout the house had made one truth impossible to deny. Mae Nak was not entirely as she appeared, and the world around him carried signs he could not dismiss. The lines between life and death, love and obsession, the living and the spirit world, had begun to blur in ways that left him breathless and unsettled. Every sound, shadow, and shifting object reinforced a mounting dread, a tension that pressed closer with each passing hour. Mak understood that the house, the whispers, and the objects were all part of a pattern he had yet to fully comprehend. He was caught between two realities, the comforting presence of Mae Nak, as he remembered her, and the unnerving signs that revealed a supernatural truth lurking beneath. The escalation had begun in earnest, and with each new layer of tension, the unspoken question gnawed at him. How far would Mae Nak's devotion reach, And what price would he pay for failing to recognize the boundaries of the living and the dead? That night, Mak awoke to a strange, oppressive stillness in the house. The usual sounds of Bangkok, the distant clatter of carts, the soft murmur of neighbors were gone, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against his ears and chest. He sat up slowly, senses on edge, and immediately noticed that the shadows in the room were different. They stretched unnaturally across the floor, bending along the walls and around the furniture in ways that defied the single candle's light. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the corner, a slight swaying of darkness, but when he turned his head, nothing was there. Mae Nak stirred beside him, her eyes open, unblinking, staring past him into the room as if watching something invisible. "Mak," she said softly, voice sweet and familiar, yet carrying a weight he could not place. "Don't be afraid. I am here." Her words meant to comfort, only intensified the tension. Mak felt a chill run down his spine, a creeping awareness that the woman beside him was no longer entirely the Mae Nak he had known. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and a low hum filled the room, vibrating through the wooden floor and walls. The candle flames flickered violently, throwing erratic, dancing shadows that seemed to come alive, stretching toward him and then retreating. The small carved figure from the back room appeared at the doorway, inexplicably moving closer as if drawn by the pulse of the disturbance. Mac's heart pounded as he realized that every object, every shadow, even the faint scent of incense that now filled the room, was responding to something beyond his understanding. The whispers began again, louder, threading through the corners of the house, repeating phrases that made his blood run cold. "Do not leave. You belong here. Do not forget. Love binds forever." Each syllable seemed layered with intent, as though multiple voices were speaking at once, converging around him. He could feel their gaze pressing in, invisible eyes tracing his every movement. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and the room itself felt alive, a vessel of energy and intention far beyond human comprehension. Desperate for clarity, Mak rose and approached Mae Nak, reaching for her hand. The instant his fingers brushed hers, the room shifted violently. The candlelight surged and dimmed in erratic patterns, and the shadows coalesced into forms, hazy but distinctly human, circling him, bending around the walls, and retreating whenever he tried to focus. The whispers intensified into a cacophony that pressed on his mind, echoing phrases of devotion, warning, and accusation all at once. He staggered backward, overwhelmed, unable to discern whether Mae Nak was shielding him, summoning him, or part of the strange force consuming the room. Then he saw it. The baby, still in its cradle, began to move unnaturally, rolling gently toward him as though propelled by an unseen hand. Mac's instincts screamed to grab it, yet when he reached out, the motion stopped. The candlelight flickered again, and in that instant, Mae Nak's expression changed subtly. Her eyes glimmered with something alien, a depth of intensity that conveyed both love and warning, warmth and danger intertwined. Mak realized in a shattering moment that she was not merely the loving wife he remembered, but a presence bound to the world in ways that defied natural laws, her devotion transcending death itself. Fear and awe washed over him as the intensity of the room pressed in from every angle. Shadows twisted, objects shifted slightly, and the whispering chorus urged him toward acknowledgement, toward recognition of the truth he had resisted. The ritual of confrontation was not about punishment, but revelation. Every movement, every sound, every flickering shadow was a lesson, a forcing of awareness. He understood then that his love for Mae Nak and his desire for normalcy could not ignore the spiritual reality of her existence. Collapsing to his knees before the cradle, Mak whispered apologies and acknowledgement, speaking words he had not fully understood until this moment. The room trembled slightly, the shadows recoiled, and the whispers softened into a rhythmic, almost gentle murmur, as though listening rather than judging. Mae Nak's presence shifted, the warmth returning to her expression, though tinged with an eternal sadness. In that peak confrontation, Mak saw the fragile boundary between life and death, love and obsession, clearly for the first time. He understood that Mae Nak's devotion, though powerful and undeniable, was not entirely of the living world. The lesson was terrifying and enlightening at once. He could not reclaim the past, could not bend the supernatural to his will, and yet he had glimpsed a truth far deeper than human understanding, the enduring power of love beyond death, and the immutable consequences of ignoring the spiritual. The morning after, the peak confrontation left, Mak physically drained and emotionally shaken. He had survived the terrifying, almost tangible manifestations of Mae Nak's presence, yet the clarity he gained from the ordeal only deepened the weight on his chest. As he rose from the small mat where he had knelt, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting the familiar wooden patterns of the house onto the floor. But even in the soft glow of dawn, the atmosphere felt heavy, charged with the memory of the shadows, whispers and flickering lights from the night before. Every corner of the house seemed to hum with energy, a reminder that the boundary between life and death had been crossed, if only momentarily, and that the consequences were far from over. Determined to understand the strange events and Mae Nak's unearthly devotion, Mak sought out those who had knowledge of the legends. He walked the narrow streets of Phra, Khanong, observing the houses with their raised wooden stilts, the small canals reflecting the pale morning light, and the quiet bustle of villagers beginning their day. Each step carried the memory of the night before, the unnatural movements of objects and shadows, the whispers that had pressed against him like invisible fingers. Finally, he arrived at the home of an elderly woman who was known throughout the district as a keeper of local lore, a woman who had long been regarded as a bridge between the living and the spiritual. The woman welcomed him inside, the interior of her home filled with the scent of dried herbs, incense, and aged wood. She gestured for him to sit and offered him tea, her hands steady and deliberate. Mak hesitated, unsure how to begin recounting the night's events without sounding insane, but the woman's calm, knowing gaze encouraged him. He described the shadows, the whispers, the strange movement of the baby, and Mae Nak's simultaneously loving, yet otherworldly presence. As he spoke, the woman listened carefully, nodding, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she sighed softly, a sound weighted with understanding. "Mak," she said, "what you have experienced is the truth of Mae Nak's story, the reality that lies beneath the legend. Mae Nak died during childbirth, yet her love for you was so strong that it refused to leave the world of the living. The devotion you saw, the warmth, the comforting presence, and the moments of terror, they are all manifestations of a spirit bound by love, by grief, and by unfinished business. She is not alive in the human sense, but her essence remains powerful, tethered to you and to the home she once inhabited." Mak felt a shiver run through him. Suddenly, everything that had seemed inexplicable, the shifting objects, the whispers, the shadows that bent unnaturally, the baby's subtle movements fell into a terrifying, coherent pattern. Each strange event had been a signal, a manifestation of Mae Nak's unresolved presence, a reflection of her inability to fully leave the world of the living. The experience of the peak confrontation was not random. The flickering candlelight, the blackened shadows, The shifting figures, they had all been ways in which her spirit communicated, demanded acknowledgement, and revealed the truth of her continued existence. The woman continued, her voice steady and unhurried. The villagers who warned you, the objects that moved, the whispers, they were all signs, ways for you to recognize the boundaries of life and death. Mae Nak's devotion is not meant to harm, yet it is undeniable in its intensity. Love can bridge worlds, Mak, but it can also blind, trap, and manipulate if left unchecked. Your recognition, your understanding, and your willingness to honor her spirit are what will determine the balance moving forward. Mac's mind reeled as he absorbed her words. The revelations reframed every moment since his return home. Mae Nak's warmth had never been a simple illusion of the living it had been. A carefully orchestrated presence, a reflection of both devotion and spiritual persistence. The shadows, whispers, and shifting objects were not random disturbances, but deliberate manifestations meant to guide him, to warn him, and to compel him to understand her reality. Each layer of tension and fear that had built over days was now seen in a new light, a method of communication, a demand for acknowledgement and respect. As he left the elder's house and walked back through the winding streets of Phra, Khanong, Mak felt both relief and lingering apprehension. The partial resolution had given him understanding, yet it did not erase the presence of Mae Nak, nor the intensity of her attachment. The house would remain a space of delicate balance, a place where love and the supernatural intertwined, and where the consequences of ignoring spiritual truth could be profound. He returned home, careful in each step, and for the first time fully acknowledged Mae Nak's presence, not just as his wife, not just as a comforting figure, but as a spirit bound by love and death. The revelations reframed every shadow, every whisper, and every strange movement. He now understood that they were neither random nor malevolent in the traditional sense, but deliberate expressions of devotion, grief, and the limits of human understanding. The lesson was clear. Love can transcend death, but it carries weight, consequences, and responsibilities that the living must recognize if they are to survive and coexist with forces beyond comprehension. That night, Mak sat in the dim glow of the single oil lamp, the house quiet but charged with an unseen tension. Mae Nak moved around him with her usual grace, tending to the small chores that made the home feel lived in, yet her presence carried a weight he could no longer ignore. Every glance, every smile, seemed to hold both love and something else, an intensity that reminded him she was no longer entirely of the living world. The realization settled deep in his chest. Their reunion, no matter how joyful, had boundaries he could not cross, and the past he had longed for would never fully return. Without a word, he rose and moved toward the door, intending to leave the house and the emotional weight behind, if only for a moment. Mae Nak followed silently, her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of warmth, pleading, and something unreadable that made his heart tighten. He felt a tug, an invisible pull, as if the house itself and the spirit of Mae Nak were reluctant to let him go. Stepping outside, he breathed in the night air, the faint scent of incense and the distant murmur of the canal, carrying a strange, almost mournful rhythm. The streets were quiet, yet every shadow seemed to watch, every whisper of the wind echoing the questions he could not answer. As Mac reached the edge of the lane, ready to disappear into the city, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears. A baby's cry, distant, yet achingly familiar. He froze, heart pounding, and glanced back toward the house. Mae Nak stood at the doorway, her figure framed in the dim lamplight, holding the baby, yet her eyes seemed to glimmer with something beyond human comprehension. For a fleeting moment, the line between the living and the dead blurred entirely. Mac stepped forward again, yet a thought gripped him with sudden, cold clarity. What if leaving even for a moment was not fully allowed? What if the devotion that had drawn him back was also a force that could not be broken, a tether that would follow him beyond these streets, beyond this life? He walked on, each step weighted with uncertainty, carrying both the memory of love and the knowledge of its impossible persistence. Somewhere behind him, Mae Nak watched, silent and unwavering, her presence lingering like a shadow that refused to vanish. And Mac knew, as the night closed in around him, that some stories never truly end. They wait, patient and watchful, leaving the living to wonder who truly belongs to whom and who will ever be free. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.